Hey folks, Doc Patterson here. Good to be with you again. Our lesson for this week comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, and I think I'm going to cover verses 17 on through about 26. You can read that on your own. You need to know as we enter into this lesson that Luke is an interesting writer and he loves conflict stories, okay? He just loves conflict stories. Now, what are conflict stories? Well, those are stories where Luke writes that Jesus intentionally offends the religious Jewish authorities, either by talking about or with non-Jews, which a good Jew is not supposed to talk to a Gentile or commiserate with them. Or he touches impure people. He violates the Mosaic law. He commits blasphemy. Now, let me just go back to the chapter before chapter 6, just to show you how much Luke loves conflict stories. This is all from just one chapter preceding the chapter we're in. In chapter 5, Jesus starts off by placing his hands on a leper. You're not supposed to do that. Lepers are impure. Then he forgives a man's sin. Well, it's not his place to forgive their sins. That's God's place to forgive sins. So that's blasphemy right there. Then he calls a tax collector to be one of his apostles. And everybody knows that tax collectors are the worst sinners around. And not only does he call a tax collector to be one of his apostles, he socializes with tax collectors. Can you believe that? Then his disciples ask him about fasting, and he doesn't require them to fast. That goes against Mosaic law as well. He allows his disciples to harvest grain on the Sabbath, and he heals on the Sabbath. And all of these things are done in front of the religious Jewish authorities. He does it intentionally, according to Luke. Now, it would be wonderful if Jesus had just kind, generous, and edifying things to say about everybody all the time. But the bottom line is Jesus could also create conflict and did with his words. And he intentionally ticked people off. And we're going to talk about both here. But first of all, let's talk about the kind, generous, and edifying and healing things that Jesus says in this passage. And all of those healing words flow out of the notion of blessing. He blesses people. And that notion of blessing is directed to most of the crowd gathered right there listening to Jesus teach. That's an important distinction because he speaks to most of the crowd, but a little bit later on, he speaks to the rest of the crowd. Well, regarding him speaking to most of the crowd, the word bless, when he blesses them, the word bless has a lot of different applications across the biblical record. There's actually too many for us to cover in this particular moment, but that's worth you all looking into. But none of those biblical applications match exactly the way we use the word most of the time today. Today, the word is used almost as meaning a special favor done for me or for you by Jesus. I don't know how many, let me give any illustrations. I don't know how many times I have heard over the past several years somebody say, everybody in my family caught COVID except me. I was truly blessed. As if Jesus didn't want to bestow a special favor on the rest of the family members, just that one person. Well, that's not how Jesus is using the word here in this passage. In this passage, Jesus is making a special recommendation with authority. before the Father for some very specific groups of people: the poor, the hungry, the reviled, and the defamed. All right? Now, when I say that Jesus is making a special recommendation with authority before the Father, let me explain that with a more contemporary example. If you found out that there was an opening for an administrative assistant to a CEO of a company in town, and you wanted that job, you also discovered that that CEO and I were best friends and we trusted one another explicitly and implicitly, and you came to me and said, I would love it if you would write a recommendation for me for that job. I'm going to tell you, my word would carry weight. It would have heavy gravity with my CEO friend, and you would indeed get the job. Well, that's what's happening with Jesus. He is making a recommendation for you specifically before the Father. And that recommendation has weight and deep gravity, okay? Jesus is saying to most of the people gathered in the crowd when he blesses them, look, I've already put in a good word, a recommendation with authority for each one of you before the Father. And then he says this, so laugh, rejoice, and leap for joy, for the Father has secured a place for you in heaven. But then he turns his attention to the rest of the crowd. Now, the rest of the crowd is made up of professional religious Jewish authorities who have come there to protest this conflictive traveling rabbi. Jesus is the burr under their saddle. Jesus knows they're going to be there because they show up everywhere he goes. They have become professional protesters. Because he's the burr under the saddle, they want him gone. And so they come and protest against his teaching and against his actions and his ministry to people in most of the crowds that he addresses. Protesting Jesus' teaching and healing is now the job of the professional, religious, Jewish authorities. Well, Jesus is ready for them. And he initiates a confrontation. He hits them with the woes. He gives the blessings to most of the crowd, but to the rest of the crowd, he hits them with the woes. Now, what is a woe? Well, in the Bible, woe has, generally speaking, two meanings. First of all, it can be a statement of grief, like when Isaiah says, woe unto me, I'm a sinful man with unclean lips. But that's not how Jesus is using the word woe here. Jesus is using the word woe as a declaration of judgment. Woe to you, he says, who are laughing now, for the days coming when you are going to mourn and weep. A little later on in Luke's account, as well as other gospel accounts, Jesus takes that statement and expands on it and gets very, very specific. He says, woe unto you, you brood of vipers. Now, that was a really, really bad thing back then to call people a brood of vipers. He says, woe unto you, you brood of vipers. You will reside in Hades, where the fires never die, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I've gone through all of this. Well, what's it mean for you and me? Really, what's it mean for you and me? Well, most of us who count ourselves as believers, we have a relationship with Jesus where we look for kind and generous and edifying embraces of the authority who takes us before the throne of God, where once again we are assured of our salvific security. I call that the embrace of blessing. And that's what all of us are looking for. But every once in a while, some of us need Jesus to poke his finger into our shoulder and woe us. Patterson, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, you're going to destroy your health. If you don't stop what you're doing, you're going to drive away a friend. If you don't stop what you're doing, you're going to alienate your family. If you don't start getting serious with your Maker, you're going to stray away from your salvific security. And the list goes on. I tell you what, I'm just going to leave you with a think about regarding this lesson. This week, most of the people that you run into in your day-to-day travels will need the embrace of blessing. Give it to them. However, you may run into a few that need the shoulder poke of woe. What will you do for them? That's the long and the short of it. Take care, my friends.